Hello and welcome back to our podcast on all things coaching in higher education. I'm your host, Tim Jansa. I'm a certified leadership and organizational development coach and a higher ed professional of more than 20 years. My guest today is none other than the Independent Book Publishers Association award-winning and best-selling author of Dear White Leader, How to Achieve Organizational Excellence Through Cultural Humility, who also happens to be an experienced higher ed leader, fellow professional coach, and the owner of Apoyo Coaching and Consulting. Dr. Joe Pérez and I met when we collaborated on a project last year, and I'm truly excited to have him on the show to talk about how we as coaches can affect equity-centered organizational change and address many of the structural issues facing our institutions.
Tim, thanks for having me on this podcast. I'm really excited about where this conversation is going to go and sharing more about who I am and what I do and what inspired me to write Dear White Leader, as well as my passion for coming alongside leaders in higher education, help them be exceptional leaders in the areas that they lead in.
Exceptional leadership, we could definitely use a little bit more of that in higher ed, can't we?
Yes, for sure.
So, Joel, many people know you as an author, as a speaker, as a workshop leader, but what they may not know is that you actually have years of leadership experience as a college VP, dean of students, and DEI initiatives. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey, maybe from higher education leadership to executive coaching and eventual to authorship? And how are you leveraging that very diverse experience in your practice today?
Yeah, so I'm one of those reluctant entrepreneurs. And what I mean by that is I thought higher education was going to be my vocation for my entire life. And so I worked really hard first at getting that doctorate, right? Because I knew that if I wanted to move up in higher education, having a doctorate would help open up doors for me to serve in key leadership roles. And that's what I set out to do. And student affairs was my background, the co-curricular, mentoring students, supervising leaders, which led me from being a hall director all the way to being a vice president and dean of students, and teaching along the way and working closely with faculty in the work that I was doing around creating more inclusive organizations, particularly in higher education. And like any time when you are in a senior leadership role, you serve at the pleasure of the president. At my last role, we got a new leader, and very much it was their prerogative to bring on a new leadership group, which is fine. That was their right to do that. So we decided it was best to move in different paths. And I, for one, thought I was going to land back in higher education. I'm based in Los Angeles. Our kids were really happy with their schools. We were happy with their schools. We didn't want to move. And so in that process, nothing was panning out. And I knew along the way, even before this, that I wanted to become a certified coach because I wanted to be able to upskill my supervision leadership skills. And I thought getting a coaching certification would help in that. And I do think it actually does. And I encourage leaders, if they're thinking about upskilling to become better leaders and supervisors, learning to use a coach approach is really important. But in that process, I realized that I really wanted to come alongside leaders. And so I got certified and started coaching because I wanted to become a credentialed coach. One thing led to another. I started taking on clients, particularly in higher education, other higher ed administrators that were familiar to me or knew me because of my long experience working in higher education and the brand that I had developed. And so people were seeking me out when I told them that I was coaching. And that continued to snowball. And now, since August 2019, is when I officially launched Apoyo Coaching and Consulting, filed for a fictitious name, and launched the business. Started with coaching, executive and leadership coaching, and then I added consulting to the mix. And now I do training. And so the way I describe what I do is that I help leaders develop inclusive organizations in order to create a sense of belonging and the psychological safety in order to meet their professional and organizational goals. And I do that through speaking, coaching, training and development, and consulting.
This whole idea of belonging, psychological safety, that's something that pops up in almost every conversation I have on this podcast. And of course, with professionals from all walks of life and in the higher ed space. I'm wondering, what is your view on the importance and the impact that an environment has where people really belong and where they feel safe? What's the positive effect of that? I think we all have an opinion on that, but I would just love to hear yours.
Well, when I do workshops for various organizations, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, higher education, I talk about the return on investment in creating a sense of belonging. Harvard Business Review published an article back, I believe, in 2019 on the impact of creating a sense of belonging and the impact that it has on retaining your talent, right? So if you want to make the business case for it, it saves you money to retain your talent as opposed to having to hire new talent. And creating a sense of belonging leads to people wanting to continue to work in your organization because they see themselves being a part of the organization, thriving in the organization. And so the business impact is huge because it saves you dollars. But also, I think from a human perspective, I think people want to be treated fairly, equitably. And as you know, Tim, society has changed, demographics have changed, and they're going to continue to morph and change. So we need leaders who, and I talk about this in the book, about leading exceptionally. And one of those is creating that sense of belonging so that people with different cultural views, political views, different socioeconomic status, different gender identities, feel like they belong in the organization. And you as a leader can develop the skills to create that sense of belonging in order for the folks that you lead, work with, feel like they can thrive and belong in that organization.
So how do you as a coach support leaders to get to that point? And at this point, you could also talk about the idea of cultural humility, which is so central to your work. How do you do that? How do you approach a leader for them to even understand that there's room for growth and improvement?
Yeah, so I believe it starts with self-awareness, which I know is not an easy thing for people. It's scary because we don't like looking at ourselves in the mirror for various reasons. We don't always like what is reflected in the mirror. But if you're able as a leader to embrace this idea of self-awareness, you're going to become that exceptional leader you desire to be. So in this case, with cultural humility, one of the key aspects or the foundational aspects is self-awareness and self-critique. So you as a leader learning to look at yourself, not just once, twice, 3 times, but for really your entire life as a leader. Because as we know, as a leader, you need to be continually improving yourself because things change, environments in your organization change. You have to develop the ability to be nimble. So looking at yourself is going to be a constant. It's not really a choice if you want to lead well. So I help leaders with that self-awareness piece. And one of the things I talk about is getting clear on your biases. What are those? And we all have bias. You can never eradicate bias, but you can do things to mitigate the impact that bias has on you as a leader. One easy thing you could start doing is before you walk into a meeting or a conversation with a colleague, a student, a faculty member, asking yourself, what biases do I need to check myself on before I walk into this conversation, right? So self-awareness requires getting clear on your biases, developing cultural self-awareness. So what cultures do you, basically getting clear on your salient identities, whatever those may be, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, however you identify those being salient for you and leaning into them as sources of strength. And then thirdly is then as you begin to develop your own awareness about yourself is you will be open to hearing conversations and getting to know the people around you. And that's where that other awareness piece comes in, or the third aspect is you will begin to hear the stories of people you work with that work for you, the students you serve. And that's going to lead to some realizations that there's some things that particular identity groups are disadvantaged with, right? Have not had the same experience in your organization that others have. So that's the second piece of redressing the power imbalances that you begin to see and recognize that ultimately leads to that third aspect of cultural humility, which is systems change or organizational change. But it all starts with you, the individual leader, but it doesn't end with you. it moves out into the organization, ultimately the institution. And I contend that into your community. And by community, I'm talking about your family, your faith community, the volunteer organizations you belong to. And I truly believe if we get better at these things, society will be in a better place than how we find it today.
So it's not about taking the sledgehammer to a system and knocking it all down and trying to all of a sudden create this wonderful equity-driven organization. It doesn't happen like that because there will be resistance, which then really brings me to what you said about self-awareness and self-critique. As you know, academics can be a little prickly when it comes to that because we are so used to being the experts in the room, right? A lot of people have built their identity around their academic accomplishments and their publication records and, all these things and the research money they're bringing in and so forth. So a lot of them really are operating from a position of privilege and positionality. For example, being a full professor, have full tenure and everything, that is tremendous privilege and is a positionality that makes it easier for you to exert your power and your influence. Of course. And I'm wondering, how do you overcome some of the resistance, which undoubtedly you're facing, especially in, let's call them white leaders? What is the resistance? And what's a technique, maybe? What's a strategy to overcome that? And how do you even recognize that?
Well, I think as an individual, that's where you hopefully have a desire to improve yourself, right? To improve your craft as a faculty member, as a dean, or you've come to realize, whether that someone points it out to you or you observe it in yourself, that there's some change that needs to happen. And so that's my hope, right? That is my aspirational hope for people. Now, if people aren't there yet and I'm leading or working alongside someone, is the ability to stay curious in those moments for you to help understand where that person is coming from and what might be the things that are blocking or getting in the way. And so I talk about developing a posture of curiosity. The idea is to remain curious or learn how to remain curious, not predatory curiosity, but genuine curiosity where you're seeking to understand versus seeking to convince. Because what I have found is that when people are asked questions of curiosity, as coaches, we're trained to be curious, right? We are trained to ask in that world that are called powerful questions, right? Where you really are creating, hopefully evoking awareness, right? So in your questions, can you reframe the way you ask questions so they're open-ended to create space for that other person and yourself to be reflective? Now, ultimately, like I said, that person may not change their view or perspective, but maybe you've created space for them to begin to realize what they're saying and for you to have a better understanding of what they're saying and even develop an approach if you really, truly understand where that person may be coming from. The thing with privilege, what has helped me when I work with leaders, whether that's one-on-one or in group settings, is the way I talk about privilege, and I do this in the book as well, is the idea of earned versus unearned privilege. There are privileges that we have that we've earned. In my case, I earned a doctorate, which has opened up doors for me, right? Also allowed me to enter into a different socioeconomic status than the one I was raised in. That is earned privilege. The unearned privileges that I have is that I'm male and I don't have to worry about where I walk at night or those kinds of things. I'm also a U.S. citizen, so I have the right to vote. That was unearned because I was born in this country, son of immigrants. So all that to say, when I talk about it in that way, people from dominant cultural groups, one, they appreciate that I acknowledge that and I talk about it in that way instead of telling people that they're privileged. And so I acknowledge that I have certain privileges. Structurally, there's some disadvantages that I have because of the way structures have been created and who created the structures. But what I have found when I talk about privilege in that way is that generally it's received well. And because people are like, oh, okay, Joel still makes mistakes. He acknowledges that he has privilege or blessings or whatever you want to do. And I don't accuse people of just being privileged. Because I think a lot of times, Tim, is people don't We do this in academia a lot. We use terms and words that we assume everybody knows. But the reality is not everyone knows those terms. So what do you mean? What do you mean by privilege? What do you mean by woke? What do you mean by diversity, equity, inclusion? Right? Getting really good, those of us who are really seeking equity-centered organizations or institutions, of defining what we mean and be willing to have that conversation where curiosity is used so that we walk away with a better understanding.
There's so much to unpack that we honestly we don't even have time for that. But I wanted to hit just on a couple of things. I come from a language and intercultural training background.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I've always been fascinated with the power of language. You talked about stories, the power of stories earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that this is something that a lot of leaders, especially those who have more of a data-driven right hemisphere mindset, easily dismiss because stories, that's fluff. Who cares about the story? It's all about outcomes, right? That's one thing. And it's a good reminder for coaches and leaders in general to remember that every person has a story and that their story matters to them. It may not necessarily matter to you, but it certainly matters to them. Also, this idea of language being simultaneously inclusive and exclusive, that's something that's always fascinates me. I mean, you talk to any researcher, anybody in academia, as you said, even between different colleges, different departments, different fields, we use words differently. And that kind of shows that to others that we're part of this group, and also shows to the people who are part of this group, hey, I'm one of you. Mm-hmm. So I think that's always an interesting dynamic here. So as a coach, to help leader or anybody really get a client become aware of, number one, their biases, how they manifest in language, how they use language, how they then perceive the language that others use as uneducated, as stupid, as uninformed, whatever. It's easy to pigeonhole that. And the thing about earned versus unearned privilege, I wanted to just kind of follow up on that. Academia seems to be one of the areas where earned privilege sometimes reinforces problems deliberately. And what I mean by that is I've met so many academic leaders who say, well, I went to the hell of PhD. I did tenure track. It was terrible. I had to suffer terrible leadership and all these things. But instead of then using their position of privilege and to say, you know what, let me try to prevent others from having to go through the same harrowing experience, they dig in their heels and they say, well, if I had to do it, you will have to do it. Is that something that you've observed as well? And if so, how do you break through that?
Yeah, no, I have either directly experiencing that with people that I used to work for, right? Well, that's just the way it is. And I paid my dues. You have to pay your dues, right? The question for a leader is, where does that come from? What are you losing or missing out on by thinking that way? What would you gain if you thought about it differently? Curiosity, right? Framing the conversation, framing it with questions. And this is not just cultural diversity, but generational diversity, right? Because we have a lot of new, younger faculty member, junior faculty member, or employees who are coming into our organizations or institutions with a different frame or lens at looking at the world. So even if you're a person of color from a non-dominant group, if you want to use that language, you can still perpetuate the problem, right? Hey, I had to do it this way, so now you have to do it this way. I go back to the belonging. If you're truly trying to create an equity-minded organization with a sense of belonging, what are you communicating by asking yourself, what am I communicating by taking that posture? One, you may say to yourself, well, I just want to, make sure they understand they got to work hard. Okay, that's important. But how may they receive what you just said? One is you don't value them because they're younger, they're not paying their dues, which then could lead them to say, well, if you feel that way, why should I be here? Why should I pursue this experience, right? If I'm being treated this way. I mean, really helping leaders, particularly those that are older, Gen Xers, boomers, to try to help them understand that they have to learn how to bridge the divide, right? Generationally, and as well as culturally, gender, sexual identity. If you do it for one, you could do it for all of them. But you got to learn the ability to recognize that you have those biases that are starting to play a role in the way you think and in the environment you're creating for people in your organization that ultimately is going to lead to people not having that sense of belonging or psychological safety they need in order to continue on and create the environment we want our students to feel like they can succeed in, right? Ultimately, it's about serving students.
It's never about the intent.
No.
It's about the effect.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And there's a long road and a very wide margin between these two, isn't there? And I think awareness is so essential to get there. You brought up the what if scenarios. I recently did a little bit of work in that space where I talked about mindset shifts that can be accomplished by questioning and shifting assumptions. And one of the things that I found very useful as a coach is working with clients before they go into, for example, what they perceive and expect to be a difficult conversation, to say, so what are you assuming right now about the people you're going into? What are you assuming about the situation? What are you assuming about what is set in stone and what isn't? And by asking these questions, I have found that some of my clients really do a lot of work very quickly and say, well, maybe if I assumed that they do want to do the right thing and not just follow procedure or whatever. It's like, just use that to go into that conversation. That shifts their mindset very quickly. So I'm just looking at the time, Joel, and I'm wondering, to kind of slowly wrap some things up, what would you say for coaches? What is like one question a professional coach should ask themselves regularly to stay aligned with equity-centered coaching and an equity-centered approach?
Well, I think you touched on it and just what you said, right?
Yeah.
Are there any assumptions I'm making before I enter this coaching conversation, or this, I call it coaching container, right? I lean into the work of Scott Shigeoka, which wrote the book Seek, which is learning to detach yourself from your assumptions, biases, and certainty.
Yeah.
Right. And so asking yourself as a coach, what assumptions do I need to detach myself from? What biases do I need to check? How do I stay curious? And am I confident enough if I notice my client sharing with me some things that may be disadvantaging some of the people they lead or some of the students that they serve or teach, right? If they're in the classroom, and learning to be curious. I also think breathing is really important before you walk into a coaching session so you can be fully present and centered. And I think those things, as small as they seem to people, aren't done enough, but I believe would be helpful in conditioning ourselves to getting better. And I believe we need to recognize that this doesn't happen overnight, right? It's not like you can flip a switch. You have to start incrementally as a coach to build your skill set, build your capacity to coach with an equity-centered mindset, particularly working with clients in academia.
I'm reminded by what you're saying that when we work with a client, that person opposite us, and it's not just us working with clients, any leader who interacts with somebody, that person opposite us at that moment is the most important person in the world for us.
That's right.
And they have a story. And I think to remind ourselves of that as coaches, I think that brings a certain level of humility into the conversation, I think, of as leaders as well. Joel, you mentioned the book Seek. Is there another framework, or maybe several frameworks or something that you would recommend for coaches to consult, maybe to draw from in their practice if they wanted to be a little more equity-centered than they currently are?
Yeah, I think Seek is a good book. I think my book also would open up a way to think about the way you coach, right? From learning to coach exceptionally is when I do these workshops for coaches. That's how I frame it, right? So Seek, curiosity, there are several TED Talks around curiosity, because I think if we learn and build our capacity to coach with curiosity, truly coach with curiosity, I think we would be the coaches that we desire to be, and we would attract clients that we want to attract. So I would say those are some things that people can read. I also think learning how to listen. I look at the work of Oscar Trimboli around how to deeply listen, right? I use his material in my book as well. The other book that comes to mind is Did That Just Happen?, which is written by a couple of I think either medical faculty or doctors at Harvard, around how do you recover when an organization or a person makes mistakes, particularly in working cross-culturally. And those are some resources that people can draw on that I believe would be helpful in helping them think through how to become a more inclusive coach and equity-centered or equity-minded.
I really appreciate that. And I think we're going to add those to the companion site as well with the links so that our listeners and viewers can check those resources out themselves. So Joel, in closing, one thing that we haven't really addressed is the fact that DEI in all industries is really under pressure and under strain. What words of encouragement would you find for coaches and professionals in the DEIB space to just keep going?
What I've shared with coaches and people, particularly those of us from underrepresented communities, underestimated communities is a new term I'm using. Yes, we've had to shift the way we talk about it, but the work still needs to get done. We still have leaders who want to get better. They want their organizations to get better, but still feel stuck and don't know what to do. And they need people like us who want to and can walk alongside them if we're ready to do the work. I also believe that the extremes, one way or the other, the pendulum is going to start moving back towards the center. And I believe as coaches, as consultants, we have to do our work with that in mind, with that optimism, or else we're going to continue or could potentially end up in dark places. Then we're not helpful to our clients that we hope to serve.
Joel, thank you so very much for your time. Everybody, it's an amazing book. Get it. It's a great resource also for coaches. And Joel, I really value your time, your wisdom, for you taking time out of your busy schedule to share this with our coaching colleagues and with people in the DEIB space in general. So thank you again. And thank you all so much for watching and listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please click the like button and subscribe to this channel. Your support really means a lot to us. And as always, you can find more information on this episode, our guest, and today's topic at our companion website, higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. See you next time, and keep making a difference, one client and one conversation at a time.